Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 30 of Death Space Filling the Void. I'm recording this on Sunday, the 23rd. Watching a little NFL football. Football, I don't know why I said it with a like that. It's definitely been an indoor weekend. We had an ice storm here in Charleston, which a lot of the businesses were closed. It's just hilarious coming from the north. I mean, it is a safety precaution, but it's a little bit of ice. You know, if we just drive a little safer, we'll be okay. But yeah, great excuse to kind of just hang around the house and watch movies and the NFL playoffs. All that except our poor Ollie. Ollie's our puppy. Went to the vet yesterday. I was there for like 4 or 5 hours. He's got to go back again tomorrow. They don't know what's going on with him, but he's not eating and something's bugging him. Probably something in his stomach, and so a bunch of tests done, and we'll see. We'll see what happens, but it's heartbreaking to watch your little puppy not feeling well. So yeah, hopefully the vet's able to figure it out tomorrow and we can get this little man back to feeling like himself. Well, I've got another great interview lined up. I spoke with Brett Wean, who I know from the New York City improv community. He's so funny. He's so good. Brett unfortunately lost his mother to suicide, and he's now the director of writing and entertainment outreach at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And he talks about all that, which is extremely brave. It must be so hard to talk about, but it all comes from a sense of trying to help others, which is incredible. Before we get started, I just wanted to offer a quick content warning. Today's episode does deal with the topic of suicide, and even though there's nothing graphic or anything like that, if you happen to be feeling vulnerable at the moment, or if the topic might be a little too much for you right now, please trust your gut and maybe listen to it at another time. Give yourself some space. I also want to mention that if you or someone you know is struggling right now, you can reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline or the Crisis Text Line, which are both free and available 24/7. There's absolutely zero shame in reaching out for help when you need it. It's a strong, responsible thing to do. I'll put all the links to these resources in the episode's description so you have it at your fingertips. Please, please, please be careful, and please, please, please take care of yourself. All right, let's make our way over to the interview with Brett Wean. Thank you so much for listening, and enjoy. Joining me now on the podcast is Brett Wean from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Brett, thank you so much for coming on.
It is my pleasure. I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, we right before recording, I was saying Brett had shared his specific title, and then I was like, oh man, I just get so panicky at the start of these for some reason. But what is your title?
You're putting it back on me so I can mess it up myself. My current title, and here's me trying it out myself because it's a mouthful, is the Senior Manager of Writing and Entertainment Outreach. And what that means is I had started at AFSP about not quite 7 years ago. And I used to work in book publishing, and I began as the senior communications writer working in our national headquarters. We have local chapters in every state. And what my job does is I work on virtually any piece of writing that you can imagine, whether it's web copy or education programs or working on national campaigns, things like that. It could be the Peoria chapter. We don't have a Peoria chapter, but like the Peoria chapter just found out they got free radio space. Do we have 30, 60, 90-second promos for this specific education? No, we don't. Okay, well, they need it in the next day or the next 3 hours or whatever. So like writing and editing, all kinds of different things. The reason my title changed is, and I'm mythologizing a little bit, but basically a few years ago, I walked into my boss's office one day and I predicted that more and more TV and movies are going to come to us proactively if their stories involve suicide or mental health because they want to get it right. And in some cases, they're probably scared of getting it wrong because of the backlash. We cut to today, and a large part of my job has become working with TV and films, giving them feedback, looking at scripts, working with their writers' rooms, looking at footage and telling them what we know from the suicide prevention research as a field. There are things we know in terms of storytelling, kind of in the same way we know a lot of things about safe reporting and journalism when it comes to suicide. And that is basically that nothing you put on screen is going to make the average person suddenly want to kill themselves. But for people who are already in a vulnerable state, who may really not be doing well, there are certain things about the way you either report in the news about suicides or the way you tell stories about it on TV or in movies that can be dangerous for people who are already not doing well. And so I've sort of created that role around myself, which is, and we can talk about how just working at AFSP in general is really personal for me, but to get to involve my sort of storytelling and entertainment background is really kind of amazing.
Yeah, and we know each other a little bit through the New York City improv and comedy scene. So for people that don't know Brett at all, like that's such a fun and important role that you've created for yourself. So congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a lot of hard work, but I love getting to be this guy who's sort of quietly behind the scenes, having an impact. I mean, I remember just sometimes for people who have been impacted by that, sometimes it's literally just a line of dialogue or something, or the way characters respond to that sort of thing in a story can have a big impact on how you feel or how someone might think about it in their own lives. So I love being like the silent puppet master. Or sometimes it's just a matter of making it safer than it would otherwise have been. It's not always about like, oh my God, thanks to my feedback, this is a wonderful exploration of mental health. It's sometimes about, oh my God, this movie that's dropping, it's going to be really dangerous, but here I've gotten them to edit it slightly so that it's not anywhere near as dangerous.
Got it. Well, I'm curious, like when you're talking about you're trying to make these shows and movies less dangerous, how so? What are you looking for? How are you trying to shape them?
So some of the things that we know from research that can be dangerous for people are if you show graphically a suicide or a suicide attempt on screen, we know that can be really dangerous for people. And that's kind of the really big thing. And that goes also with dialogue in terms of talking in great detail about a method that someone might use. That can be like pretty triggering. These things go back to, there's a thing called the Werther effect and the Papageno effect from Mozart, and different storylines from as far back then that sometimes, depending on how they're handled in a work of popular entertainment. And then it really just comes down to, it's not a simple kind of set of specific, that's sort of the big thing, but it gets into real subtlety in terms of, does the story involve a universe that seems totally hopeless, or is it one where help is available, whether the character realizes it himself or not? It's not a situation where I ever want to be like a network censor or something. It's about really exploring what the voice of that show or movie is. I don't want people to feel constrained. We want people to feel encouraged about exploring this stuff and just finding creative ways to just avoid those little landmines that might be dangerous. It really depends on the specific show and what their voice is.
Yeah, it's got to be extremely subjective, exactly what you're describing when it comes to tone or the circumstances of it. But nonetheless, it's good to have someone such as yourself taking a look at it, because people who are just writing shows really may not have any idea what they're doing when it comes to talking about suicide.
Yeah. In my experience doing it, most of the time it's not that they want to do anything dangerous or what. My favorite moments are, and this is how it generally goes, is that sometimes just in talking to me and finding more out about what the field of suicide prevention knows about it in a scientific way, and what leads someone to possibly attempt or take their own life. Often I will leave meetings with writers getting like really excited with new possibilities.
Oh,
So
good.
it's very rarely a situation of feeling pushback. They want to get it right, and it's generally not a matter of me saying no, you can't do this. It might just be little things. Maybe it's a wide shot. Maybe this is over audio. It's usually not about showing that specific moment of pain. It's, if you really want to get into that story, it's probably about what preceded it and what comes afterwards. And if you do want to show that moment, there are ways of doing it that are safer.
Got it. Is there a movie or a show that you've seen somewhat recently that you think has done a good job at talking about suicide?
My favorite one, and it's one that I like to reference because a lot of people don't know about it, but it's not from too long ago. There was an Australian, I don't know whether to describe it as a sitcom or not. It was a half-hour show called Please Like Me, which is more recently on Hulu, and it's genuinely really, really funny. I can list so many things I love about that show, which are that it starts out, the first episode is the character, it's a young guy, and his mom has just attempted suicide, and she goes to live with him so he can sort of help her out. So of course, on a personal level, and maybe we'll talk about this, that speaks to me in my own experience, having a mom who struggled. The way the show sort of follows that whole storyline is really, it feels very authentic and real, but it's also genuinely funny, and it's sensitive, and you get a feeling over the course of the series that mental health isn't something that is just something some people, some like weird people experience. It's, we all have mental health. You know, I think the thing with comedy in terms of this particular thing is you never want to punch down. It's not like making fun of someone's pain, but I mean, I guess we're jumping in here like right in the middle in a nonlinear way, but I remember a moment growing up where my mom, who had a lot of mental health challenges and was often suicidal, and who also, by the way, was very funny. But I remember one moment when I was a little kid of her just like freaking out, and my grandparents were over, and she grabbed a lamp and she threw it out the window, and we were all in her bedroom. And we watched through the window as though time had stopped, as the lamp kind of sailed out over the front lawn, looking as though it was heading toward the kind of brick path going up toward the house. And it didn't quite make it. Like we were holding our breath watching it, and it didn't quite make it. And it ended up landing on the grass in this sort of dull thump. It was very anticlimactic.
You didn't get that break?
And so it didn't break, it just landed on the grass, and we all just sort of stood there for a minute in the middle of this high drama. And my mom, she sort of took a second and looked at it and looked at us, and the dog looked up at us and looked back at her, and she, like, after a moment, she walked past us, and we watched her walk down the steps, and she walked out onto the front lawn, and she took the lamp and she took it back into the house and walked up the steps again, past us into her bedroom, and she threw it out the window again. And
no, oh my gosh.
And this time it made it. And that's a very dramatic and in some ways very sad. She was in a lot of pain, obviously, but you can't tell me that there isn't some comedy in that.
Yeah, that is very funny, right? Comedy is like the setup and then the denial of or fulfillment of an expected outcome, right? To really make it into a math equation. That certainly fits that description.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you is, and we've started on the conversation, we got a little into your current role, but unfortunately you lost your mother to suicide. So tell me a little bit about your mom. What was it like growing up with her? I'd love to find out who she was.
It's one of those things where when I tell people sort of the big headline, which is that I lost my mom to suicide, and now I work at the country's largest suicide prevention organization, and that feels really personal to me, and it's become a great thing. It's really, though, the story of what happened with my mom. It wasn't really all about that moment of losing her, which was just 10 or 11 years ago. Basically, I grew up with the funniest, nicest, best mom you can possibly imagine. And the only problem, I'm making this sound like a movie tagline, but the only problem was she kept trying to kill herself.
More than one occasion.
Yeah, I genuinely can't tell you how many, because how do you how do you quantify it exactly? Was it every time she ended up in the hospital?
Oh my
What
goodness.
time she took a lot of pills? Chances were she knew that she would be okay, but it was she sort of knocked herself out for a day or two. People talk about it being, oh, it's just a cry for help, but it's a if you're on the beach and someone is in the water and they're crying for help, that's something you always need to take seriously. So yeah, most of the time she was this very fun-loving, spirited person. She had a lot of friends. She was very well loved, very lovable. But then on some days, she had a problem with depression. And ultimately, I didn't know this as a kid, but after as an adult, when I moved to New York and I started seeing a psychologist myself, mainly just to know what to do to help her. Am I doing everything I can? And of course, that ended up being support for myself too. My guy ended up being able to talk to her occasional. She had a psychiatrist who she wasn't really in serious therapy. She wasn't really engaging and go to him when she, every once in a while when she wanted like a pat on the head or get a refill on her, either sleeping pills or he would try her on different medications. And so all things being relative, I'm lucky in the sense that a lot of people who've lost someone to suicide, sometimes it happens out of nowhere. There are warning signs we know to look out for, but not everyone knows to look for them or spots them. And I was relatively lucky in the sense that I knew her diagnosis very well. I knew that she had borderline personality disorder, which is really, really complicated and difficult to treat.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I don't quite know what borderline personality means. And obviously there's probably a spectrum, but I'd love to know just a little bit about what.
So I want to be clear, I'm not a mental health professional myself. I work alongside the leading suicide prevention experts. So I want to be careful about my trying to find borderline personality disorder because it's such a complex thing. I can tell you from my own personal experience with my mom, her mood would change. And this is also, she probably had bipolar disorder too. And so what I experienced with her was, some days great and fine, but she would get so sort of paralyzed in her thinking and trying to problem solve for herself that would get frozen. And so she would catastrophize a lot and sometimes be histrionic to the point of being irrational. So that was sort of my own. I think it depends on the person to some extent. I would really recommend for anyone who's seriously interested in that. There's a book by Dr. Marsha Linehan. This is someone who created dialectical behavior therapy. And that and cognitive behavioral therapy are two therapies that have been proven to be helpful with people who are suicidal.
Okay.
And so Marsha Linehan's book is about how it's partly a personal story and partly about how she created DBT. And it talks about how she was hospitalized herself when she was really young. And the way she puts it was that she wanted to come up with a way, she wanted to show other people a way out of hell. And she created this cool therapy that I think is a combination of, it's sort of like cognitive behavioral therapy is, it gives you a lot of tools that you kind of learn how to use during moments where you're not struggling and in pain that severely. And so when you are, you can do certain things. And if I could go back, every once in a while, I'll feel guilt. I mean, I was trying so hard to help my mom over the years that for the most part, I can assuage any momentary feelings of guilt, knowing like that I did all I could. And that was the therapy for me was worth the price of admission just for that. I had a momentary thought of should have pushed my mom more with that. And then I realized, wait, my doctor actually did recommend that. And I did try and get my mom to look into that.
You said that you recognized like the floor would drop out for your mom where she'd be really happy and okay, and then have really low days throughout your whole childhood. This was something that she always lived with.
Pretty much. I mean, I think it started a little bit before I was born too. And my parents divorced. They separated when I was in first grade.
Okay.
So it was me and her. We were close with my grandparents who didn't live far away. And my dad was around, but he wasn't right there. But yeah, I remember when I was very little. Sorry for the sirens, by the way. As though to prove that I live in New York City.
Yes.
For the most part, she was like the best mom in the world. But there were days where it was her situation was more complicated than just depression, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I found out, but she'd get very depressed, or she would just be lying in her dark room. And the other thing that feels weird to say that it's interesting because I lived through it and she lived through it, but I think one of the other interesting things about her story is that, we had plenty of money. We lived in a very wealthy area. She had a hard time figuring out holding down a job, even though she was very, very smart and could have been really successful. She had a hard time with that. And by the end, and she just had less and less money. So often money would be a thing she was stressed out about. And even though she could problem solve brilliantly for her friends and for other people, she would just get paralyzed in kind of fear and not be able to handle it. And so like by the end of her life, she wasn't out on the street, but she was homeless. She was the last year of her life, she was couch surfing and would sort of lash out at me by not telling me where she was.
Oh my gosh.
So it was really nightmarish. And even growing, it got more and more dire later on. But I went to this, my school, it was really important to me that I preppy private in my little penny loafers, but there were some times where it was like a little touch and go whether we would have food. It went back and forth wildly.
Oh my
So
gosh.
it was very much part of my experience was that made it difficult was I was the child, she was the adult, but I couldn't, like I wasn't able to sort of put my hand on the wheel because there was no reason we should have had to go through that. And yet her illness kind of made it really, really difficult.
Yeah, my gosh, that sounds so hard. I mean, I'm also not a medical anything, but having mental health issues and then money problems on top can only exacerbate the problems. I mean, it helps things unravel. I mean, I definitely have anxiety, but people obviously have more pressing issues. And I know for me, like when times I've had money issues, like anxiety is just, it fills the void where calm thinking could also be, it just makes things so much worse. So I'm sorry that you guys went through that.
Well, thank you.
Well, did she ever talk about her mental well-being throughout her life to you? And was she trying things, or was she say that she couldn't handle them? Or I'm curious how she spoke about it and how that may have changed throughout her life.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think she was aware that she had mental health issues. Yeah, it was tough because the way I would put it is like, if your leg is bothering you, it's your brain's job to tell you, oh, it's time to go see a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's something going on in your brain, your leg doesn't doesn't fill in and tell you. So I think it gets in the way. But yeah, like she knew. There was one moment, I forget what was going on at that particular time, but I remember her on the phone with me. And I partly like to tell this story in general because both for people who are struggling themselves and also for people who are worried about them or have someone in their family or a friend who they, has some sort of mental health situation going on. We don't talk about it as readily as we do physical health. And so there's very much a feeling of being alone and not being able to talk about it. So I'm happy to share, and I think it makes a difference. I think it would have made a difference. I think how the culture is encouraging people to get help and making it not seem scary and making it as getting to a point where we think of mental health as in as matter of fact a way as we do physical health, recognizing that we understand suicide in the same kind of way we look at physical, other leading causes of death. We know things about suicide scientifically and what's going on in someone's brain. When they reach that point, we can encourage people to both get help and know how to connect others to help and not feel as though there's such a stigma with it. I think young people have less and less so of that, but it would have helped with my mom. And I think that got in the way of her really genuinely engaging in therapy. But I remember along the way in later years, it had really become a situation where it was very hard for me, and it took a long time to figure out how, but I needed to create some sort of healthy boundaries because she would call me constantly, whether I was at work or at home. There were times she would call my bosses. She would find out my boss's numbers and leave hysterical messages, or my girlfriends occasionally and things like that. So I did have to figure out how to create boundaries. And it ended up being a matter of, it was a very subtle kind of thing, and still being very supportive of her and talking to her often, 2 or 3 times a week even. But
It's
I
gotta be so
remember
hard to
her,
strike that balance.
it was so hard. And if anyone's listening who has at all anything like a similar experience, I'm so sorry for them and for the person
Mm-hmm.
they care about. But what worked for me was, it wasn't a matter of tough love and saying, hey, you can't call me this many times or after midnight or whatever it was. And it was hard because she and I were really, really close.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved that. And I didn't want to change that. I didn't change it. But it became a thing of like, she doesn't need to know where I am every single day or night. I
Yeah.
don't need to report it. I don't need to tell her every single new person that I meet. And their, and it was a little bit painful, but it was a very gradual, subtle thing. Of the other thing that worked is, often if she left me one of her quote unquote bad messages on my answering machine or voicemail, I would often really want to put out the fire quickly so I could get on with things and not be worried about it. But I figured out, maybe if she leaves me a message that is lashing out at me, maybe I don't need to call her back that night. Or maybe I wait a few hours, or maybe I call her back the next day. And I think those boundaries actually helped her. But I remember one time where she was kind of feeling that a little bit and angry about it and in pain on the phone. And she said, I need you. I need to know you're there when I call you. And I remember she said, I'm not right. Meaning, there's something wrong with me. And that just like my heart so much, and it still hurts thinking about. And it was frustrating though at the time, because it's like, yes, and there's no shame. Even as a little kid, I knew something wasn't right and that it wasn't her fault. And it felt weird because with a physical illness, you'd be able to tell other people and get support for that. And I remember the frustration though, which was also fair, was like, yes, we both know we both know something's going on, and all I'm asking is for you to show up at your shrink's office every week or two, and just all I can ask is that you show up, but you're not doing that.
Why do you think she didn't want to do that?
I think it was terrifying for her to, I mentioned her money stuff. She put so much stock into defining herself as someone who was from a certain strata of society. It occurs to me that the one big thing I haven't mentioned as part of her story is that she literally had a hole in her heart. And so that sounds like a terrible metaphor, like my mom had a hole in her heart, but yeah. I mean it literally. And so her childhood early on was like a lot of very experimental, at the time, surgeries. And by the time she was a teenager, she was okay. But I think that affected her a lot. I think it was hard for my grandparents because they had already lost a kid, and they weren't the kind of people who would spoil their children. But I think in my mom's case, they'd lost her sister, and my mom was really sick as a kid. And so they kind of, I still wouldn't describe it as spoiling her, but they erred on the side of, she got first row tickets to see the Beatles and the Stones when they were first in town. And
cool.
She had a cool sports car, and it was hard for them to, not just because of that, but because of her illness and the way it presented itself. It was hard for them over the years to put their foot down and say, no, you need to go and deal with your stuff now. And slowly the money was kind of running out over the years.
Got it. That makes so much sense to like why you wouldn't feel like you had to show up places if I guess you never had to in certain circumstances, and things kind of work out. I can see that.
So I think for her to really engage in therapy, it was really scary for her, and she would have had to really painfully take a look at herself, and in ways that sort of more matter-of-factly were like, okay, you have this much in the bank right now. It's time for you to get a job. It doesn't mean that you're going to be, you can't automatically be president of ever. And it was tougher as the years went on and on and on. She ended up finding something that she really enjoyed doing, which I think was like her dream job, which was part of what was frustrating, was that when I was in my 20s, she realized that she would make a good real estate agent. And in fact, she really did. But because she was very smart. Something that I think speaks to her thought process is that She was working for a law firm in Philadelphia when I was a little kid as a paralegal, and they were so impressed by her and I think frankly charmed by her that I remember the head of the firm offered to send her to law school for her and for her to continue working for them, which speaks to what she was like.
That doesn't happen.
I'm sure, yeah, it doesn't really happen anymore. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And she soon after that thought of a reason to quit her job. But with real estate, she was able to use that sort of legal acumen in terms of looking at contracts. And she was she was a really funny, charming person, actually, when she wasn't crying in her room. Mm-hmm. And so she, real estate, especially if we lived on the main side of Philadelphia. And so it's a wealthy area. For most people looking for a new house, it was like, I'm sure there were stresses involved, but it was often a happy thing. Mm-hmm. And my mom was a good salesperson and she enjoyed taking people out and looking at houses and negotiating, and it just checked all the boxes for her. But she was also pretty unreasonable in certain ways. When she was getting started, she only wanted to handle the really big houses. And when you're starting out, like the head of the real estate company was like, let me give you some houses to handle and that are smaller scale. And my mom didn't want to do that. So that was her illness. To really engage in therapy would have been to having to demolish some of the structure, the foundational structures kind of her psyche about her place in the world, and being more realistic about it.
For you and your grandparents, I mean, what's this like as you're watching someone you love fail to get the help they need and not maybe put up these structures that you're describing to prevent herself from being able to make changes and feel better about herself? What is that like?
I think I used the word frustrated. I remember when she ultimately did die by suicide, people who have that loss experience, and I realize this now even more because of what I do and where I work, it's such a complex combination of emotions. Any emotions they experience are totally okay and normal, but I think often people feel anger. I didn't mostly feel anger. I felt just frustrated because she was a very competent person and very charming. She could have charmed her way to the top of anything. But when I think of something like cognitive behavioral therapy or diagnostic behavioral therapy, like those practical strategies, 100 years from now, we will probably understand even better really specific things. And we have learned a lot from science about suicide now, but there are things that could have helped her. And so my feeling was mostly, I felt anger at different times. It was never wanting her not to be around, but it was, it was a lot at times she was never a burden, but it was a lot to deal with. And so whatever we can do culturally to encourage, to make people realize that they don't need to take it on alone, whether they're the person themselves or the person supporting them, can help, because there are things we know work.
Like what? I'm curious to hear.
So those therapies work. I think I honestly just feel like culturally, if we can make it a thing where even people just taking mental health days at work and realizing that our mental health really is a real thing. We've proven through research that for most people, either therapy or medication are helpful. And yet people still, there's kind of a stigma with it. You don't go to see your psychologist in the same way you would just automatically go see someone for a physical illness.
Yeah, I interviewed someone from the Centers of Anxiety and Depression for a different podcast. And he made the point that you go to the dentist 2 times a year. Why isn't it considered normal healthcare to see a psychologist routinely, like even once every 6 months? And you could do more, but like that gets you in the door, that gets you started. A simple change like that, I think, would go such a long way. And it would, if it was required, the stigma would be removed because everybody was going, right? That's a big thing, and that people don't want to be seen as, I'm doing air quotes, crazy because they're going to see a therapist. That's such an outdated view of therapy.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I want to say is that, not to look at this all with rose-colored glasses, but the fact of the matter is it's not always easy in our country to find help. At the end of the day, help is always available. There's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. There is the crisis text line. There's always something, and those are free and 24/7. And there are, if you go looking for it, there are resources like that where help is always available, but it shouldn't be so hard with all the insurance stuff. And one of the other things that AFSP does is we have a public policy office in DC, and we have all these what they call volunteer field advocates for volunteers who want to get involved in sort of political advocacy. They give you templates for emails, and you can just press a button and lets you know what things are going on. It might be something involving mental health parity, which is like the insurance is supposed to cover mental health in the same way it does physical health, and it doesn't always. So that's one of those things that we have to fight for. And so they make it easy to be as involved as you want to be, whether it's just sending an email or if you get really involved in that aspect of it. I was able to go to the House and the Senate, and they set up meetings for our volunteers to share pieces of legislation that are going on at that moment and to share their personal stories in a short way to clarify why it's important. So yeah, you asked what can be done about. I think there's a lot that can be done. There are a lot of things we know from the research about. You can't look at a specific person and say, I'm going to stop Brett's mom from killing herself. But there are tons of things we know statistically work to lower suicide rates in communities. The more I learn about it, a lot of the stuff is sort of deceptively simple in a way. And so like there have been studies that putting simple suicide prevention education in communities, the rates go down. Sometimes it involves temporarily reducing access to means of someone killing themselves. And so we know that putting boundaries up on bridges lower the rates in those communities. And the very reasonable misconception people have is that, someone might say, well, if someone wants to kill themselves and they can't get up on the bridge, or they don't have access to whatever their preferred means are, they're just going to find another way. But all the research, all the gazillion studies have shown that, in fact, if they don't have access to their preferred means, in most cases, they don't go on to die by suicide. And the reason for that is that the specific cognitive state where someone is about to take action and try and take their life, as opposed to just thinking about suicide or even planning, which are different mental states, that specific acute state only typically lasts for a certain number of minutes.
Oh, wow. So it's like if the moment passes, if they're not able to get on that bridge or this way or that way without going into too many different ways of committing suicide, it passes that quickly.
Yeah, I think it speaks to I think people are sort of geared innately, the human animal is geared to survive. Just instinctively, if there's a bear running towards us, we run into the cave or whatever it is we need to do. And so I think when someone in a really painful suicidal state is really struggling, part of them subconsciously, I think is often looking for a way out of the state to get help. And so it really, just having people feeling comfortable enough and knowing how to talk about suicide when it comes up. And knowing how to have those conversations rather than fearing that they're going to get it wrong and not having it. Sometimes it really is as simple as someone saying, you don't seem like yourself, and trusting their gut. That is often the release valve that the person needs to finally say, you know what, I'm not doing well. And that leads to them getting help. And they're, in a way, part of their brain, I think, is looking for those moments. Even just training frontline workers in ERs to ask about that kind of thing as a matter of course. That's often all the person needs to say, yeah, you're the first person who's asked me. Yeah, I actually have been thinking about it.
Yeah, I've gone to a bunch of doctors recently, and they've all asked questions like that. And it's been eye-opening because I've never asked that before, but that makes perfect sense that you're here. Maybe this is the time that you feel comfortable opening up and opening the door to getting that care. So that sounds like a great idea. Yeah.
Other things like what we call postvention. And what I mean by that is, as opposed to prevention, is God forbid, one of your employees or one of your students takes their life. How do you handle that? There are guides that are available with how to respond to that in a safe And that's one of those moments where someone taking their life in your community, if it's handled badly, it could lead to other people taking their lives, or it could lead to a lot of people actually accessing help and learning more about mental health. For instance, when a celebrity dies by suicide, if the journalism and the reporting on it is really sort of unnecessarily graphic or glamorizes it in some way, that can lead to what they call suicide contagion, where the rates go up. But also, surprisingly, I forget if this was across the board or just in certain areas where the reporting was handled really well. But with Kurt Cobain, when the reporting was done well on it, it actually led to more people asking for help. And I think it may have even lowered the rates. Yeah, and that's all about, similar to the storytelling stuff, not focusing on the method and using it as an opportunity to share resources. So they would say, if you're struggling, there's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, the crisis text line, things like that. So it's really simple stuff, but those are the things we know statistically lower the rates.
It's so uplifting. I mean, not to belittle it, but it all just seems like very simple and easy steps that we can, it's not something daunting that we need. It's not like we're curing cancer. It's just more seemingly like we talk about it.
It's literally just like more people learning what the warning signs are. We have these things that I helped create called we had a campaign called Real Convo.
Okay.
And we created these guides that are the Real Convo guides, and it gives you like really specific guidance. One of them is like, if you're worried about someone, how do you ask them if you trust your gut? If you think they're thinking about suicide, how do you have that conversation?
How do you have that conversation?
You ask them the one thing we know from research. If people take one thing away from this, it's you trust your gut. It's basically if the person doesn't seem like themselves, and you ask them directly. I think it's really reasonable that a lot of people worry that asking them will put the idea in their head or it'll push them into action. And the research all shows that that's absolutely not true.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And so, the one thing I would say, and I can give you the links for the guides if you want, it's afsp.org/realconvo. Just asking them in a matter of fact, non-judgmental way. You don't need to try and problem solve. You just sort of be there with them and kind of along the lines of being a good improviser. It's active listening and just being present and being like, I'm sorry you're going through that, and I'm here with you. We're going to get you through this.
I'm on your side, holding space. Exactly.
All that stuff, and realizing that you're not a mental health professional probably, and that it's about encouraging them to reach out for help. And that might mean, it depends on what you feel able to do and what they need. But aside from just saying you should get help, maybe it's about, I will help look stuff up for you and figure it out with your insurance, or I'll get on the phone with you, or I'll sit with you while you do it. Are you going? You have your appointment this week. Are you going? Do you want me to pick you up? Or
that's great. Yeah.
How about if I pick you up afterwards and we go for coffee?
Yeah, that's great, man. That's so encouraging that these are that it's out there and it's things that we can accomplish this, right? We can do that as friends and people. So that's great.
Since I imagine a bunch of improvisers will be listening to this, since you're such a great improviser,
thank you.
And people might know you from that world, make it a twofer and be like, hey, your appointment's on Thursday. My show is on Thursday. I'll pick you up and you can come see my show.
Yeah, there you go. If you're listening to this podcast, one of the reasons may be because you're interested in having your death or a loved one's death be celebrated in a different way, to think outside the box a little bit. I personally really like the idea of that. And that's why I'm partnering with a company called Spirit Vessel, who creates these guided, personalized ceremonies for yourself or a loved one. Well, just to give you a little bit of background, Spirit Vessel is a sister-owned company that is bringing sacred ceremonies around death back into the home in a beautiful and meaningful way. I love it. I love the idea of making it more personal. And I've experienced wakes and funerals that it felt so cold and wish that I could inject a little bit more personality and more storytelling to help the grieving process. Spirit Vessel has these handcrafted ceramic urns and personalized celebration of life ceremony packages that can be done in the comfort of your home or through webcasting services. Whether you're grieving the loss of a loved one, preparing for an imminent death, or taking steps to plan for your own death, Spirit Vessel provides resources to help you respond from your heart with creativity and courage. So basically, you can design your own creative and personalized intimate ceremony that represents the person who you're celebrating. And there's also tips to help people who are grieving going forward. So whether you're interested in the celebration of life ceremony packages, or you'd like to check out or order one of their handcrafted ceramic urns, which are so cool, by the way, check out Spirit Vessel. And if you do order anything, feel free to use the promo code DEATHSPACE for free shipping. If you're like me, it can be really hard to come up with the words to say in a card. I know, I always laugh too, because talk about 10 years of improv training down the drain. Not being able to come up with anything. But that's especially so. I don't know why I can say especially. There you go. Perfect. I can say it. During times of grief or when someone loses someone. But thankfully, there's the Cardist Studio. There are no words to comfort in a time of deep loss, but you send a card because you care. Yeah, because as we've learned through this podcast, sending something, saying anything, is better than saying nothing. The Cardist Studio creates your message, writes it in your card, and mails it for you. See? They'll help you out. You have the intention, the Cardist has the words, bing, bang, boom. All you do is pick the card and tell why you're sending it. No anxiety, all care. For a message from your heart, but not your hands. Just sit back and enjoy your relationships. You know, you don't want to have that awkward feeling like, was that too much? Did I say too much? Am I talking too much? As I'm literally talking too much? As opposed to figuratively talking too much, Pat. All right. My inner voice is kind of mean to me. TheCardistStudio.com, thoughtful, just got easy. And better yet, you can use the promo code DEATHPOD, one word, for 10% off all orders. You ever lie in your resume? Huh? Look at me. Look at me when you're lying. No, you should never do that. That's a terrible idea. But it can be daunting to look at a job listing, see everything that you have and things that you probably don't have. But we can fix that with My Software Tutor. My Software Tutor offers 3 levels of real-time Zoom-based courses with a live instructor. So I'm going to keep you on task. They've seen it. They've heard it. They've seen the resumes. They know the holes. But they're here to help. They'll deliver practical, functional business skills in a friendly and supportive environment. It'd be funny if it really wasn't a supportive environment. Like, when are you going to understand this? Of course, that's not the case. That's just the anxiety or reliving fear dreams we had as children. These courses will increase your marketability. The job market couldn't be better right now. So it's a perfect time to invest in yourself and improve that resume. Whether you're an employee, job seeker, consultant, or contractor. You can sign up for these classes at mysoftwaretutor.com and use the promo code POD20 to save 20% off all registrations. Would you look at that? All right. Enjoy that new job. The last year of your mom's life was extremely difficult with her couch surfing, and you're trying to help her. Describe to me what it's like when you find out that your mother is gone and has committed suicide.
And I'll use this opportunity to move things forward a little too, which is that a lot of people don't realize this yet, so this is not a note. But we try and encourage people not to say commit anymore, because it makes it sound like a crime, which is very outdated as opposed to a health thing.
That's good to know. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, and if you notice, most like major newspapers and news outlets don't say that anymore. You can say it pretty much any other way. Killed themselves, or they took their own life, died by suicide.
Okay.
So when I found out my mom died by suicide, someone had actually arranged for a place for my mom to stay for like 6 months, which then became a year, free of charge. People really pulled major strings with a charitable organization they were involved with. But my mom saw it as being like the end of the road. It was going to be like 30 or 40 minutes away. It wasn't in the nice area, and she thought it was the end for her. And meanwhile, she needed to get out of this where she was by a certain date. I was trying to be helpful with facilitating that. And by, the weekend before, I was like, that's it. I offered to come in and be with her and help her move from one place to the other, and she wasn't calling me back, and she wasn't. And finally, I was like, I'm not doing this at the last minute. And at the time, if this gives you an idea, my wife and I still had a landline with an answering, like a cassette answering machine set up
Oh, wow.
to it, literally just for my mom, because I didn't want to give her my cell number, because I didn't want her to be able to catch me literally at any moment. And the answering machine was off and the volume was low and all that. And so I was doing some work, and I was wondering if the phone was going to ring with either her or someone trying to get her out of this place or whatever it was. And I would often, for my own mental well-being, I would often let her or whoever, if it had something to do with her, leave a message first. And then I would listen to it as soon as they hung up, and I could call back. And it wasn't as immediate feeling for me. So I heard the message and I went to listen to it, hoping it wouldn't be like her refusing to leave and the cops being called or something. And it was, I don't know if it was the landlord or someone who was involved in the whole situation, left me this message, and he said, this is a terrible thing to leave on your answering machine, but your mom was supposed to blah, blah, blah. I forget exactly what he said, but by the time we got there, she was gone. And the way I heard that, because I was ready for all this sort of chaos that I didn't want to be brought into, I thought he literally meant she had left the apartment.
Right. Yeah, that's reasonable.
And so when I first heard it, I was like, oh, well, good. I don't know what's going on, but at least she got out of there and I'm not being called to deal with it and all that. And then he went on for a few more seconds, and it just dawned on me. The context became clearer. And I realized, oh my God, she's gone. I realized what he meant. And I was in, you can't say, it wasn't surprising in a way after all those years, but it was shocking. So yeah, my memory of that was, I was at home at the time, which was a nice thing. I didn't have the pressure to go into an office. It happened to be a slow time at that particular time of year. It was like a physical trauma kind of for the next few months. I remember times where I would be sort of lying on the couch, and maybe my wife would be somewhere else in the apartment, and I'd be like watching a movie on a laptop or reading, and I'd feel perfectly fine in that moment. And all of us, this was like a couple months later, or something like that. And I would just suddenly feel like, with no warning, I would just be racked with sobs, and then it would be gone, like it would be over just like that. And so it was just years of tension. And one thing that I remember, this was really important for me, and it might sound terrible, but I think it's important if anyone's listening to this, if they've experienced the same thing. I mentioned that any emotion you feel is fine and reasonable, and sometimes the emotions will conflict, or if different people from the family are navigating a loss like this, they might be feeling different emotions at different times. But I remember maybe a month after my mom died, one of her best friends who'd known her since middle school called me up to check in. And at one point in the conversation, she said, I don't know, this might sound terrible, but on some level, I wonder if you're feeling a sense of, and I expected her to say anger, because that felt like the cliched thing. I really appreciated this person, but I was, on some level, I was like rolling my eyes, expecting her to say, you might be feeling some sense of anger. But she didn't say anger, she said relief. And the thing is, I was, and it in no way meant that I was glad that my mom had died. It was a horrible, horrible thing. If I could travel back in time and do anything to stop it, I would. But after so many years of being so stressed out and worried literally every day, I wasn't relieved that my mom was gone, but I was relieved at not every day for decades. I'd be stressed about the phone ringing at any given moment with some sort of total chaos that I had to deal with. And so my mom, it was never a burden on me. I know, like, something that suicidal people feel is that they're a burden. I would never describe my mom as a burden, and I would do anything to have her back. But part of one of the emotions I was going through was a sense of relief that I at least didn't have to worry.
I completely understand that emotion. That I lost a grandmother to dementia, and watching someone, I'll use the word deteriorate, because it's an awful disease, but at a certain point that you're just like, that poor woman was suffering and didn't deserve that. So I understand that it feels similar, just sort of like the circumstances of what they're going through is so painful to witness, that there is a sense of relief, I guess, as
Yeah.
awful as it is to say.
And the complexity of it is that, again, that frustration that there was no reason for her to have had to die.
Mm-hmm.
There was help for her. There were things that could have helped her like figure out her life and in fact make anything. She was still pretty young. It just involved really taking a hard look and accepting help. So that was what was hard about it.
Yeah, I've taken up a lot of your time. I've just two final thoughts that I'd love to get before we end here. One is, you mentioned some of the resources that are out there. I'd love to hear those again. And number two, what helped you on that, on your path of recovering and dealing with your mom's loss? There's certainly many people out there who have lost someone to suicide. So I want to try to help them, or at least give them a path that may work to help them.
Yeah, there's stuff for people to realize that it does get easier, and there will always be that loss, but it won't feel as, you won't be feeling it as keenly.
Yeah. Well, Brett and I, in our original recording, hit a little bit of a technical audio issue. So if this sounds a little bit different, it's because we recorded it later, but it's very important that we get this information in here. So apologies if that was jarring, but I wanted to bring Brett back on so he can tell us a little bit more about AFSP. So Brett, why don't you take it away?
Sure, I'll give you a little snapshot of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, AFSP. Basically, it was started in 1987 when a few families who had lost loved ones to suicide got together with a small number of scientific researchers who wanted to learn more about suicide and what we can all do to prevent it. And so we really started as a research organization. We're still the largest private funder of suicide prevention research, and we lead research efforts around the world, figuring out new ways, things that make a difference and can help prevent suicide. We can't look at one person and say, I'm going to stop that particular individual from taking their life. But there are things statistically we know that have been proven to help prevent suicide. So suicide is preventable. So we've got research. We have Out of the Darkness walks, which take place in communities and campuses all over the country through our chapters. We have chapters in every state. I think I'm going to get the number wrong. It's in the 80s. We have like 87 chapters or something like that right now.
That's great.
You can go to afsp.org and there's a find a chapter page, and you just put in your zip code, and chances are there's a chapter near you with other people in your community who already sort of get it. You don't have to over explain anything if you have some connection to suicide and mental health. So we've got chapters, we've got research, we've got walks. We also have a public policy office in Washington, D.C., and volunteers all across the country can sign up to become volunteer field advocates, where we fight for smart mental health and suicide prevention legislation. It can be as easy as like clicking a button and sending an email to one of your representatives. They make it really easy for you. And some people get very, very involved in the policy and advocacy aspect. We have an advocacy forum that takes place every year in Washington, D.C. I've been to this, and they arrange meetings on the Hill, and you go up and have meetings with representatives, and it's very cool for people who really get into that aspect of it.
Yeah, that's great.
We have a loss and healing department, which provides support for people who've lost someone, who've been affected by suicide. There's a cool program called Healing Conversations, which arranges, whether it's phone, video, or in person, a meeting with trained volunteers who have themselves lost someone to suicide, and they know what that feels like, but they're also on the other side of it. And some time has gone by, and they help. It's a really cool program. They help provide understanding and support, often soon after someone's lost someone. We also have education programs, and all our programs are sort of evidence-based and clinically informed. And through our local chapters, you can bring programs like Talk Saves Lives to your workplace or to your church or your school, or, we have different education programs. And I think I'm not forgetting anything aside from Project 2025, which is an initiative that started a number of years ago, we sort of looked at all the ways that that research has shown we can help prevent suicide 20%, lower the rate 20% by 2025. And that's if we get buy-in from things like hospital systems and the corrections environment. And we looked at ways that we could save the most lives the fastest, like from a general health perspective through different areas. So I've probably forgotten something. And for support, often people will, even though we're America's largest suicide prevention organization, the first thing they'll think of is, oh, you're like a crisis line. That's the one thing we're not. And we suggest people reach out to our partners like the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which I'm very honored to be. I'm on one of their committees, though I don't work for them. And that's 24/7 and free. And if you're worried about someone, it doesn't have to be you who's struggling. So the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The other one is the crisis text line, which is basically the same kind of thing. It's crisis services, free 24/7 for some people picking up the phone if they're really struggling. It's easier to just text. And there are different crisis resources for veterans and things like that. And we have, a pretty clear link to those services on our website for those other organizations.
That's great. It's so thorough. It's just so nice to hear how much there is out there for people to get support however suicide has touched their life. There's just so much going on. So that's incredible. And always want to encourage people that there is help out there for whatever you're going through, and should absolutely take advantage of one of these resources if you even think you need it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's hard is just starting that conversation. If you're worried about someone or if it's for yourself, it's really hard to start that conversation, which is why it's really helpful for, anyone to just make mental health just a thing that they get used to talking about on an everyday basis, and letting their friends kind of organically know that they're a safe person to talk to about it. There's no shame in it. We all have mental health, just like we all have physical health.
Absolutely. Well, is there any social media you want to mention for either yourself or the AFSP? I don't know why that's
really hard. It's a tongue twister.
It is.
I have sometimes thought about starting a game show where I tell people our organization's name, and then they have to quote unquote guess it right afterwards.
Yeah.
People say Federation. It's tough. Yeah, we're AFSP National is what you would look for on all the things, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. We just started on TikTok. So it's on all of those things. It's at AFSP National. And if anyone is interested in following me, you can find me. It's just my name. It's at Brett Wean.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the original interview and then coming back here. It's your openness and honesty and how brave you are to talk about such a difficult aspect is incredible to see.
It has been my pleasure, and I love your podcast, and it was an honor and a privilege.
Thank you. That's very nice of you. Just want to reiterate, if you or someone you know is struggling right now, you can reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline or the Crisis Text Line, which are both free and available 24/7. Like I said in the intro, the information will be in the description for the podcast wherever you're listening. So please reach out if you need it. And thank you so much to Brett Wean and for everything that he and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention do. I learned a lot in that interview, and well, thanks again, Brett. Next week's show will be Death Space Filling the Void Season 3's finale. Got a bit of a different one lined up. I'm interested to see how people like it, but it was certainly fun to make, and hopefully people are into it. As always, if you're liking the show, please remember to rate and review it on whatever platform you're listening to it on. And to check the show out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Also, my other podcast called That Gives Me Anxiety, which is about to go weekly. I'm projecting in March. I'll start it up going weekly. So yeah, that's exciting. And I'm working on season 4 of Death Space Filling the Void right now. And once again, I'd like to mention and thank the sponsors. Spirit Vessel, use the promo code DEATHSPACE, one word, for free shipping on personalized urns and the Celebration of Life ceremony packages. The Carta Studio, you can use the promo code DEATHPOD, one word, for 10% off all orders. And My Software Tutor, you can use the promo code POD20 for 20% off all orders. Thanks again to all those companies. Well, have a great weekend. Take care of yourselves. And I'll talk to you on Thursday for the season 3 finale. Yeah. Oh, my voice got real high there. What a range.